Death by merchandising. Hello and welcome to HydraCollectables, where we let our geek flag fly. My name's Luke and I'm your host, and today we are going to discuss how Marvel, aka Disney, secured their win against Fox. Before we get started, I'd like to encourage you to hit that subscribe button. We put out geeky content every week, and if you'd like to be ahead of the curve, you can also hit the bell icon. Do you guys remember when 20th Century Fox breathed new life into the X-Men franchise by allowing their First Class and X2 cast collide in X-Men Days of Future Past? And yet there wasn't a huge merchandising push regardless of this hype. Over the last few decades of these comic book movies, we as fans have come to expect these summer blockbusters to come with a rich array of toys and consumables, yet with these Fox movies they just didn't seem to happen. Despite these characters originating from Marvel Comics, after the sale of 20th Century Fox as a movie property, Marvel ended up only receiving less than 5% of any Fox Marvel property gross, and so, in order to better their own profits, Marvel, aka Disney, opted to focus pushing toys and merchandise for Guardians of the Galaxy, an IP they actually owned full rights to, at the end of summer rather than X-Men. Many started to believe that Marvel would begin to shut out all properties they no longer held full rights to, and eventually these concerns became truth when Marvel executive editor Tom Brevoort, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Brevoort, I have no idea, responded to a question on Tumblr about the lack of X-Men toys. He responded, "If you had two things, and on one you earned 100% of the revenues from the efforts that you put into making it, and on the other you earned a much smaller percentage of the same amount of time and effort, you'd be more likely to concentrate more heavily on the first one, wouldn't you?" And he was absolutely right, of course you would. At this time, Josh Trank's reboot of the Fantastic Four hadn't yet finished production, but Marvel did start to ramp down on Fantastic Four comics, eventually cancelling them altogether earlier that year. Now, it's worth noting that Fantastic Four comics and merch didn't really hold the same value to Marvel at this time. They weren't really making big buck on that stuff. However, this did have an impact on the rest of the industry. At this time, Marvel Comics was currently in the middle of a summer comics tie-in event called Secret Wars. No, not that one. And promised to change the entire Marvel Comics continuity by its end. Online rumours and suggestive wording in promotional material seemed to indicate that the X-Men and all mutants in the Marvel Comics would be exiled off of Earth and forced to have their adventures in space. Marvel X-Men writer Chris Claremont was documented with website Bleeding Cool saying that Marvel writers were no longer allowed to create new X-Men characters because Fox could conceivably use them in future film. The war had begun, and Marvel had already seen that both Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, characters that were both mutants and Avengers, were able to appear in both cinematic franchises and had their origins retroactively changed in Marvel/Disney films to make them mutants no longer. For the most part, this war stayed completely out of the comics and only existed in merchandising. However, Marvel toy lines at the time saw huge reductions in the number of X-Men characters and promotional art, replacing characters from Fantastic Four and X-Men with those from the MCU. Very sneaky, Marvel. Around this time, we also had two major storylines that would ensure the mutants would fall off radar with younger fans. One being the classic House of M story arc, where Scarlet Witch declared the words, "No more mutants," forcing the introduction of new characters to come to a screeching halt, as Claremont had previously said. As well as this, we also had the reintroduction of the Tyrian Mist to create more inhuman characters rather than mutants, most notably Camilla Khan, aka Miss Marvel. Marvel has obviously remained silent on these issues, with top executives from 20th Century Fox as well as Disney denying that these merchandising shutouts had even taken place. But to me and so many others out there, it just seems too obvious. This is exactly what they were doing. It's also worth noting that Sony's Spider-Man property, besides being a shared property with Marvel, aka Disney, was one of the highest value properties in the world, and Disney's right to make animated TV shows with the staple of characters kept them in profits, regardless of Sony's actions. Since the acquisition of Fox, mutants appear to have made a huge return to Marvel, with new writing teams headed by Jonathan Hickman bringing all their dead characters back from the grave. Now, how they opt to reintroduce mutants into the MCU remains to be seen, but I for one am incredibly excited. So there you have it. That is how Disney were able to secure their win against Fox. Now, it's worth noting that they obviously gained a lot more properties, not just superheroes, during this acquisition of Fox. However, this did force their hand. You know, yes, we did have these movies. We had these X-Men films. They were out there. They were great. But receiving PG ratings, 12 ratings, you know, anything along those lines meant that kids didn't know who these characters were. Kids weren't buying the fancy dress outfits, kids weren't playing with the toys, kids weren't reading the comics, and this basically brought that whole thing to a close. A lot of kids out there nowadays, as oddly as it sounds, probably don't actually know who Wolverine is, and their introduction to the MCU will be the first time that a lot of these new fans would see those characters. So with all that in mind, that's me signing off. Please do let me know in the comments below which mutant character you are most excited to see in the MCU, and how do you think they're going to handle this introduction of new characters. I know a lot of people are excited about WandaVision, and a lot of people are excited about Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. So please leave your comments down below. And until next time, I'll see you in another life. Take care.